This session is called Where Tokenization and Smart Contracts Fail, Practical Biz and Legal Needs. Our next teacher is a finance and securities attorney, very well known for his expertise in secure lending and alternative finance. He's a pioneer in building out the ecosystem for digitizing and trading securities on the blockchain and other distributed ledger technologies. He co-founded VerifyInvestor.com, which was the dominant accredited investor verification service in the world at the time it was acquired. He has advised prominent companies such as tZERO, Polymath, and Prime Trust. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jor Law.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you guys for joining us. It's late in the day, and there's snacks outside. So today I want to talk a little bit about tokenization and smart contracts and when they fail effectively business transactions. You know, for those of us who are in the industry and we're working with smart contracts for like a technical need, a lot of times the smart contracts are fairly simple. They're fairly self-explanatory. They work quite well. But you've got this whole other industry that's coming into blockchain in finance and securities and capital markets, et cetera, and they don't quite understand smart contracts quite as well. So they're trying to take these complicated instruments and complicated financial instruments and legal contracts, and they're trying to distill it into a smart contract. And what I've noticed in working with some companies is that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the business people and the lawyers and the developers that are programming these smart contracts. So I thought it would be great to do a session to kind of analyze contracts, what makes a legal contract, what makes a smart contract, and where the disconnect between the two are. So this is a no-show conference, so I'm not going to get into this, but effectively, I've helped or worked with these types of companies, and they're either law firms in a space, or they're AML, KYC type of providers in a space, or they provide tokenization technology or trading, all around security tokens typically, but otherwise slightly more complicated uses of financial instruments that might require slightly more complicated smart contracts. So, you know, it is a contract, so let's do what lawyers start off first with, and we all love definitions. So let me run through maybe about 10 minutes or so of different definitions, and when I look at definitions, I'm looking at definitions that, you know, everyday people would deem as definitions, as well as perhaps what the law may deem as a definition, right? So if you look at just Wikipedia, not the world's best source, but you know, certainly one of the most consulted sources. This is their definition of a contract: a legally binding agreement which recognizes and governs the rights and duties of the parties to that agreement, or legally enforceable because it meets the requirements and approval of the law. And if you think about this, it's what we expect. It's an agreement between two parties to do something, either agree to do something or agree not to do something, right? And the keynote here really is, and you see it twice in the quotations, is that it has to be legally binding and enforceable, right? So effectively, some government or rule of law is behind this, right? Some governmental authority with probably some sort of police powers is what gives a contract kind of legal status. You know, once you get lawyers involved, you take that simple definition and this is what you get. It's significantly more complicated. And these are essentially screenshots from two sites that cater to legal professionals. And you see that it's far more complicated. And the reason for that, of course, is that lawyers bill by the clock, and the more they bill, the longer they work, the more they get paid. No, I'm just kidding. The reason is, of course, when you are dealing with contracts or when you're dealing with law, you have to cover, you know, every scenario, right? When you're dealing with definitions, the definitions have to be clearly defined, because how you define something and then how you apply that rule of law is designed to apply to everybody. So if you haven't covered all the circumstances, you could have unintended consequences of a vaguely defined term or something like that, right? So let's go through the elements of what actually constitutes a contract and what makes it legal. And this goes back to what, you know, effectively something that's taught in the first year of law school. And And then for most people, that's when they learn about what contracts are, and then the rest of their careers, they don't really think about what contracts are. So I actually had to like research this to do this slide. And in reality, it's about 4 to 7, maybe more, elements, depending on who you ask and how detailed they break it out, right? If they break it out to a few things, then it's closer to 4. If they, really kind of go into the nuances, they can come up with 7 or more. And one of the first concepts, of course, is offer and acceptance, right? And these are really 2 separate concepts. And the offer and acceptance in a contract, is Alice making an offer to someone, and then maybe someone, Bob, accepts that offer. And the interesting thing here is that they're different, right? A lot of people who aren't, trained attorneys, they think of offer and acceptance as effectively one thing. You enter into contract, aha, it's done. But the way the law works is that if someone makes an offer and you don't accept it exactly the way it was made, it's deemed effectively to be a rejection of that offer, and then a new offer is made with the counteroffer, right? So let's think about that through an example. If Alice makes an offer and says, I will sell you my car for $1,000, and she makes this offer to Bob, right? Now Bob has a decision. Bob can decide to accept the offer, reject the offer and walk away, or he can counteroffer. So let's say Bob says, no, how about you sell it to me for $1,000, but you also paint it blue for me before you do that, right? So, and if Alice at that point says, sure, most people just think that, oh, okay, a contract's been formed because 2 people agreed to something. But behind the scenes, from a legal perspective, what has happened effectively is that Alice has made an offer to Bob, car, $1,000. Bob has said, no, I reject your offer. And then Bob has said, here's my counteroffer, here's a new offer. And then Alice, if she accepts it at that point, becomes the person that accepts it. So instead of Alice being the person that makes the offer, now Bob is the person that makes the offer, right? And this goes back and forth like a ping pong until there's some agreement. And that leads us to kind of the next element, which is meeting of the minds, right? And meeting of the minds effectively is what you think it is, right? Effectively, there must be an intent to be bound, right? Someone can't accidentally, think that there is an agreement, right? Like if you have a contract with somebody and you say, aha, here's a contract with that person, and that person's like, I didn't even know I was entering into a contract. Of course, that shouldn't be an enforceable contract, right? So effectively, meeting of the minds means that there's an intent to be bound and the parties intended for this agreement to be enforceable. And then another really important concept in contract law is something called adequate consideration. And adequate consideration effectively is that there's something given or in exchange for this contract, right? It's just a gift, right? If I say, here's $1,000 and there's no conditions, well, that's not really a contract, I just gave you a gift, right? But if there was a condition to, here's $1,000 and you agree to do this, or you don't agree to, or you agree that you won't do this, then now there's a reason for that contract. It's more than just a gift, right? And the consideration could be for money. It could be, I give you money. It could be, I will do something for you. If you do this, I will do this. And it could be the restraint or the choice to not do something, right? Like I normally could have gone to get ice cream, but you told me that if I didn't go get ice cream today, then you would give me another treat. So the important thing here is that adequate consideration, that word adequacy does not, they don't really say that, they don't judge how much adequacy there must be, right? So if we wanted to, we could enter into a contract where I gave you $1 for something that was worth much more than $1. But as long as there was something given or of value, that's what adequate consideration is. And effectively, those are the 4 main elements. Of course, there are other things, the person entering into a contract should be competent, should have the capacity to do it. They shouldn't be like drunk. They shouldn't be like a minor. The contract should be legal. It shouldn't be something that, for example, you shouldn't a contract to kill someone or murder someone would not be an enforceable contract just because it's an illegal purpose. And certain types of contracts have writing requirements just because they're too valuable or they're too important that if they're not in writing, there's a concern that there might be additional fraud in there. And there's a whole laundry list of these additional miscellaneous things that sometimes people call as elements. But the ones that I've kind of got in the earlier bullet points, those are the core things. That's what actually, in most states, creates a legal contract. And anything short of that, not a legal contract generally, right? So let's talk about a little bit corporate and securities. And when I talk about corporate securities, I mean the industry and in general, right? When you're doing business and in a corporate world, or if you're issuing out tokens that represent securities, well, now it goes beyond contractual. Now you have regulatory as well. And regulatory for corporate and for securities is very, very complicated, right? And it's tied to jurisdictions. Whereas a contract might be between two people, and yes, you could get jurisdictions if they're from different places. It's much simpler to understand. But once you start getting into the corporate world and the regulatory world, then you realize that, heck, I could be in the U.S., or I could be a Malta company operating in the U.S. and selling a STO or ICO in Singapore, and suddenly I'm worried about 3 different countries, and then within the U.S., because I'm hitting all of the U.S., now I'm worried about 50 states and territories, right? So the jurisdictions matter a little bit, but one way to kind of simplify how we think about it from a smart contract perspective is you just think about it as all contracts, right? So when you're dealing with the corporate and securities world, you've got consensual contracts and agreements that we think of, which are I, Bob, will buy from you, Alice, 20,000 tokens for $10,000, right? That's the contractual element that you have to deal with, and that's in every securities transaction. That's in most corporate transactions, right? But then you think about all the other things that the law imposes, right? If the U.S. government and the SEC says, well, in order for you to conduct this offering, you can only sell it to these people. You can't do this, and so you have to do this. You have to file a Form D, and you can't market things like that. Let's think of those as just contractual terms between you and the government, right? So even though it's regulatory, it's complicated, you can think of everything together as just a contract, and a contract is basically a positive requirement. You must do this in order to comply with the law or the contract, or negative, you cannot do this, right? Let's go back a little bit into definitions. Now we move to a smart contract definition. And in general, I don't like the smart contract definitions I've pulled up, but I wanted to get them from similar sources, right? So in Wikipedia, the definition of a smart contract is a smart contract is a computer protocol intended to digitally facilitate, verify, or enforce the negotiation or performance of a contract. Smart contracts allow the performance of credible transactions without third parties. These transactions are trackable and irreversible. Now, for us that are in the space, we might disagree with every statement here. For example, the last statement, the transactions are trackable and irreversible. Is that really a definition of a smart contract, or is that really just a desirable attribute of a smart contract? Reasonable minds could differ, right? And if you look at another definition from Investopedia, which is a kind of a financial oriented dictionary, they say smart contracts are self-executing contracts with the terms of the agreement between the buyer and seller being directly written into lines of code. The code and agreements contained therein exist across a distributed, decentralized blockchain network. Now, this definition also has a whole bunch of flaws, right? For example, it assumes that there's a buyer and seller, but what if it's a landlord, and a tenant? What if it's a roommate agreement or something like that, right? And it makes certain assumptions about decentralized ledger technology. But if you think about this definition and this definition, they're similar, and basically, they're just computer programs, right? And we've seen other speakers throughout the conference kind of allude to the same thing. And in fact, if you go to the definition of computer program on Wikipedia, it's a collection of instructions that performs a specific task when executed by a computer. A little bit, circular, and then this second useless statement that says, most computer devices require programs to function properly, and it probably doesn't belong in this definition. So if you take in what we know about what a real legal contract is, and then what people try to believe that a smart contract is in lines with a computer program, and you bring that into the financial world and the legal world, and what they really want a smart contract to be able to do, you get maybe a slightly revised definition, which is that, hey, if maybe a smart contract is a computer program that's intended to replace or supplement a legally binding contract, right? And this is not an official definition or anything like that. It's trying to draw the connection between a real contract, a legally binding contract, and a smart contract. And for good measure, let's look at some proposed definitions from various states. New York has a smart contract shall mean an event-driven program that runs on a distributed, decentralized, shared, and replicated ledger that can take custody over and instruct transfer of assets on that ledger. And in fact, Arizona, Tennessee, Nebraska, Ohio, all roughly the same, like virtually identical in some cases. What's really interesting about this is if you break this definition apart, it's really they're focused on event-driven, they're focused on essentially the distributed, decentralized, the DLT aspect of it, and they focus really heavily on this idea of custody and transferring of assets on that ledger, right? So a fairly limited interpretation of smart contract. What is actually missing from this is the idea that a smart contract actually is a contract. Now, I didn't include the quotes from the New York Law section, but they have another section effectively that kind of explains how a smart contract might link to a regular contract, right? And effectively, the suggestion is that a contract that incorporates elements of a smart contract is still okay. And let's talk a little bit about smart contract attributes. And this kind of gets into the beginning of how we think about smart contracts and how they're slightly different from maybe how we might think about things in a real world of like paper written contracts drafted by lawyers, right? And we already established effectively that smart contracts are computer programs, right? So they effectively need to be comprised of some sort of logical if-then statement type of structure. And to a fair amount, to some degree, legal contracts are the same. They just are a little bit more sophisticated because you have more room for interpretation, and you don't have to kind of get it exact. So one of the things, of course, with smart contracts is the inputs and assumptions, right? For every contract that is ever entered into, there's a universe of inputs and assumptions, and this is true of non-smart contracts as well, paper contracts, right? But when it comes to smart contracts and you're dealing in just a digital world, and if you're dealing with just a blockchain world, the idea is how do you get your input, right? Is your input driven by something that is already on the blockchain that you could derive from the blockchain? Is it driven from something that's digital? Is it not driven from something that's digital, right? In the blockchain space, we think of this obviously as oracles. So this idea of we have to have certainty as to where this data comes from has to be very clear, right? And this is true of US contracts as well, right? Like if I write a contract and I talk about, well, if the interest rates are X dollars, then your interest rate shall be X dollars. Well, how do you determine interest rates, right? Interest rates could differ from bank to bank, country to country, et cetera. So they may reference one particular interest rate, right? And that happens in the real world now. But of course, when you're in a smart contract world, in a digital world, then you're limited to how do you get that input into a digital format so that it could be automatically read by the smart contract and the automated portion, right? And then you've got the same problem on the other side. You've got the output issue, right? So what is the eventual action? It's easy for me to say, well, if you sell me your car and you deliver title, I will give you money. At some point, I'll give you $1,000, right? I can end a regular contract at that because at some point I will go to Bob, or Bob will go to Alice and say, well, I've bought your car. I agree that I now have the car. Let me now give you money. And whether he writes a check or sends a wire or pays in gold or something, it's understood how to do that. But in a smart contract world, that's not quite as easy, right? Because if you say, if you're on Ethereum and you say, well, the end result of this is, Bob will pay Alice, 20 Ether, it's fine. That can be done. But what if it's like, I will pay you 20 US dollars, right? Now you have to think about, okay, well, that's kind of not on the blockchain. Is there a way to do this? And of course, now, we're fairly far advanced. There are mechanisms to at least do this digitally, but off-chain, right? But what if it was, I will deliver to you, if you give me a car, I will trade you my bike, right? Now, you can have a smart contract try to do that, and say that that was the desired outcome, but you have to figure out how do you replicate that action in real world. And that is the divide of the digital and real world, right? How do we reconcile what happens on the online world with the offline world? And one thing that you might think about is stablecoins or collateral-backed coins. Let's talk gold, for example. Obviously there have been a lot of people that have kind of come out and said, oh, well, now we're going to have a gold-backed token, right? But what does that really mean, right? Does the token, is the token represented by gold? Each token is X ounces of gold, and there's gold in collateral. Is the token a equity interest in a company that goes and buys gold? Or is it just a token that represents a revenue share tied to gold, or some profit participation in gold? That's some sort of investment contract. And if you think about that, it's actually not a new question, right? Like even kind of before blockchain and before tokens, et cetera, right? If you were going to invest in gold, and there were similar instruments, right? The token that is backed by gold collateral would be kind of like the gold-backed dollar, right? And the person that was buying a token that represented an equity of a company that went and bought gold, well, that's just like me investing today in an LLC and just getting a paper stock certificate. That LLC goes and buys, $100 worth of gold. I have 10%, therefore I have roughly 10% of gold minus, administrative and management costs, right? Or a company forms itself as an LLC, I get 0% of it, but then they enter into this contract and they say, I'm going to go buy $100 worth of gold, and by signing this contract, I agree that you will have rights to 10% of it, right? So now I don't have the underlying collateral, I have no right to underlying collateral, I have no right to the company, I just have a right to this kind of contract. So this divide between digital and real is something that I think in our industry, in crypto, we kind of understand reasonably well. But the financial world, lawyers, capital markets folks, they don't understand it so well. So it's important for you guys to understand how to explain this and that this exists, because someone will come to you and say, hey, build this contract, we're going to tokenize gold. And you have to stop them and say, well, what do you mean by this? Like, what do you mean by tokenizing gold, right? And of course, there's legality and enforcement, and this is a whole different animal. Are smart contracts law? Are they enforceable or not? It's a big debate without a clear answer, right? If you go by traditional contract law, of course, I went through the elements earlier, a smart contract by itself typically wouldn't have all of those elements. Now, it could, right? You could create a smart contract where people both kind of digitally sign a smart contract and enter into agreement, and it's all for legal purpose, et cetera. And that smart contract might be, something that is a valid contract, but for the most part, most smart contracts probably are not real, real contracts. But what you could do, of course, is you can incorporate smart contracts into legal contracts, right? So if a smart contract is, and think of a smart contract as a extension of a legal contract, right? So if you think of a contract as a single page contract, Bob and Alice hereby agree to, I, Bob, will send you, Alice, $1,000. You, Alice, will, give me a car for, a blue sedan. And they both agree to it, and all the elements are met. That's a valid contract, right? If they had a third clause that said, in addition, you'll make sure that the items on Appendix A are complied with. And maybe Appendix A says you will paint the blue car to a red car, right? So that Appendix A would be part of the original contract, and therefore that entire contract would be legal and binding, right? So what you could do is you could have legal contracts reference smart contracts. And if the people have agreed contractually to honor the kind of the output or results of that smart contract, and that's how you kind of backdoor into smart contract being a real contract. Identity, of course, is interesting because contracts require identity. I can't go into a court of law saying, my Wells Fargo bank account number 22406 did business with, this Bank of America account number 2XX whatever, and there was a valid that concept doesn't exist, right? The law is built around, this concept of persons, and persons could, of course, be legally recognized persons like entities, et cetera, right? So identity is important because, well, you look at Bitcoin, you look at Ethereum, you don't really have identity, right? You have this address that, may or may not represent someone. And the best you can really get is you can figure out who you're doing your business with, the AML KYC part of it, and then you can verify that at some point in time that you've done that check, they control that particular address, right? And the checks that you do against that particular address are, you don't know if that is for sure that person. You don't know if that's that person and their spouse. You don't know if that's that person and their business partner. You don't know if even if it is that person today, you don't know that it's that person tomorrow, right? So there's certain aspects of smart contracts in certain chains where identity poses a large issue for financial capital markets, the legal and business world, where identity is actually very, very important and kind of counterintuitive. So last thing I kind of want to cover is the concepts of what do we think about when we are matching contractual needs, the real world legal business financial world contracts with smart contracts, right? And as I indicated earlier, all contracts, whether smart or not, implies some sort of obligation to pay, obligation to do something, obligation to refrain from doing something that you otherwise would have had the right to do, right? And if you think about it, and this makes sense, if there is a certain business term or desired provision that you want captured, well, then either it has to be properly captured either under the legal contract, the written contract, or the smart contract. It's got to be one or the other. You can't just have it magically missing because then there will be no record of that agreement. And it's very important that the contract and a smart contract should not conflict. And that makes sense. And you would think that makes sense, but in the real world, that's pretty complicated, right? I think Harvard, I can't remember who had done a study where they looked at whether smart contracts kind of did what the people that were doing ICOs said that they did. And there's a high percentage failure rate there, right? But it's actually not that surprising. Even when you look at legal contracts, it's not uncommon for a single transaction to have a lot of contracts, right? So you could enter into one contract and it could have like an M&A agreement, could have a purchase agreement, and the purchase agreement could be of assets, but then there's real estate, so you've got a separate real estate purchase agreement. But then you might have an employment agreement and all these things, and all of these contracts have boilerplate, and occasionally lawyers will pull precedent from different deals together, and then now you get one clause in this one agreement that doesn't quite match this agreement, and sometimes it's okay. For example, if one agreement says it's governed by Delaware law, another one says it's governed by California law, not the end of the world. It's not great. It's not the end of the world. There might even be a good reason for that, but ideally they don't conflict, right? And that makes sense, right? You shouldn't have a smart contract that violates the purpose of the regular contract and vice versa. Otherwise, which one governs, we don't know, right? So the drafting principles, of course, in programming, computer programming, it's logic and modularity, right? It turns out that that's the exact same principle in corporate transactional drafting. It's the same thing. Everything must be logical, and it's fairly modular. So for example, if we enter into agreement and you come to me, you say, Jor, I need an agreement, here are the terms, throw in a confidentiality clause, throw in a non-solicitation clause, throw in an indemnification clause. Well, that's all modular. You say, oh, you want confidentiality? Let me go look at my library of different confidential terms, and I decide to write one, and I plug it in, make some edits to make sure that it works with the rest of the contract. In smart contract, I make sure that the terminologies and commands were the same. And I'd pull it out. And in fact, you see that people have done that, right? This is a slide that I stole from Polymath, and they basically created smart contracts to govern the issuance of security tokens. And because they were trying to create something that would be a one size fits all type of thing, they were forced to kind of go with a base module, the base smart contract represented by blue, and then depending on what country you were in and depending on what rules you wanted to apply, you just pull modules from their factories, and then you create this custom kind of smart contract with all the right modules for you. Let's go through some of these scenarios to try to really illustrate the concepts I talked about earlier. In theory, it's a simple thing to understand. In practice, it's much more difficult. So going through some of these exercises, I think, will kind of help us really appreciate where these kind of gaps in contracts versus smart contracts, what business people want, what lawyers want, versus what developers and what smart contracts can actually deliver are. And it's okay that there are gaps. We just have to understand where those gaps are and make sure that they're plugged, according to the earlier kind of principles, which were, of course, something must be covered either under the regular contract or the smart contract, and that they can't contradict. So let's talk about a fairly simple transaction, which I think most people will understand, which is a real estate transaction. And in this particular real estate transaction, I want to talk about a scenario where the real estate developer wishes to raise capital by promising the investor a percentage of rents collected, right? The basic transaction is effectively, I will give you 10% of the adjusted rents that I collect. And my question is, if we're going to do this as a smart contract, how would we do it, et cetera? For this scenario, let's go through each one of these questions, right? And I'll lead this, and please kind of participate on this. Can this be done by exclusively by regular contract? Does anyone think that it can't be, for example? Right? Of course, the answer is yes. In this case, these things existed before blockchain existed and smart contracts existed. So the answer, of course, is one. Here's a more challenging question, which is, can this be done exclusively by smart contract? Does anyone want to take yes as an answer here? Okay, great. Because now I'm going to ask you, if you were going to do this via smart contract, or as much of it via smart contract as possible, how would you do it, right? Like, it's a simple statement. I will give you 10% of the adjusted rents that I collect, right? So let's think about what this means. What are the inputs and assumptions that you need to do this through a smart contract? So maybe you can kind of say, what input do you think you need? how will you calculate that input, and how will you grab that input for the smart contract? You know, let's think about how this might be done, or some of the issues that you have to think about, right? And these are the same issues you have to think about whether you're doing this by written contract or as a real estate contract. And that was great. I mean, that's effectively how you would have to do it as a smart contract. And let's look at what the limitations in kind of what she said are. You know, how easy is it to do this, and what the assumptions are that make it doable, right? So if you look at this, I will give you 10%. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's not clear how I will give you the 10%. It's not clear what the 10% will be paid in. Those are things that could be clarified in the contract, would be specified out in a smart contract. But of the adjusted rents I collect, right? So one of the first questions is, what is rent? How is it being collected? You know, right now, if you guys are renters, or you remember the days when you were renters, you would write a check, or you might pay in cash. Someone would come collect it, and you would trust that person to go deposit it into the bank, right? So today, if I'm an investor under this exact same scenario, today I'm trusting the real estate developer, or, you know, in this case, it'd probably be the manager, to go collect the rent, deposit it into the bank, and then tell me what the rent was. And I'm assuming that they collected all the rent, that there wasn't a secret rental contract between the tenant for a higher amount and a lower contract that they've shown me or not shown me at all. I'd have to assume that they deposited all the money in the bank. And then this word adjusted rents. Then I'd have to figure out, well, what's adjusted rents? You know, presumably in a legal context, adjusted rent would be, you know, taking out maybe costs of the business, right? So you get gross rent, but, well, you know, gross rent, I had to pay fees to the bank. You know, maybe I paid someone to go collect it for me, things like that. You know, whatever it was, I collected $100 and now I only have $90, right? So the question, of course, is, for both a legal contract that's written, we have to figure that out. So now in a smart contract world, how do you figure that out? How do you deal with adjusted rents? What's the best case scenario there? What would the requirements be for that to work in a smart contract world? So there are a couple gaps that we see here, right? So in some of the gaps aren't so bad, right? So in this world where I can write checks and I can pay cash, you know, there's certainly an amount of trust there, right? But if they had employed some sort of digital service that was a third party that said, well, if you pay here, and or if you send the wires here, then we will convert it to Bitcoin, and then we'll bring it onto the chain that way, and you pay it to Ethereum, we'll bring it onto the chain that way. Well, then you've kind of bridged that gap a little bit. It's not perfect. It's not 100% smart contract only, but you've taken steps to kind of bridge that gap, right? And that's important in all of these contracts, because most of the financial world in the real world, they deal in fiat, right? And they want things to be done in fiat. And in the crypto world, there's no way to do that. The closest way is through some sort of stable coin, right? And then from an adjusted rents perspective, now you have someone reporting that they have certain costs. And if all those costs are not part of the system, if they're not a part of the blockchain, how do you go and document that, right? And there's various mechanisms, some which require more trust, some require less trust. You know, it could be that someone reports it themselves, and there's a challenge, you know, process available. It could be that a third party collects this and reports it. It could be that someone reports it and a third party validates it and things like that. It could be that all the intermediary institutions are blockchain friendly and they will, you know, post it to the blockchain for you. So depending on where in the life cycle of blockchain technology we're not quite there yet to do all that, but certainly each year that passes, we're getting closer. You know, this idea that you could now take a credit card and get Bitcoin in return, that exists now. That didn't exist, you know, a couple of years ago, right? So that's another gap that we have to address, like this adjusted rents that I collect, right? And then, of course, you've got to pay for it, right? And if you and then when you pay the 10%, if someone wants fiat, then there has to be a conversion. That a little bit, at least, is a little bit easier these days because there are known oracles and data centers to do this stuff. You mentioned something that is important for every single contract, which is how you enforce it. And this is one of the most commonly misunderstood areas, I think, of smart contracts because I've met with regulators and I've met with people who for some reason the smart contract space and the blockchain space is so new to them that they think that all the existing rules are threatened, right? So I've sat across the table from regulators that said, well, but then how is governance going to work? Like, what if someone cheats someone? Well, as you mentioned, we can handle this through the smart contract to some extent, right? We could have some method where if Alice and Bob enter into the smart contract, and if Bob or Alice kind of believe that there is an error, they can halt the contract, kind of go through some sort of on-chain governance mechanism, or even a combination of on-chain, off-chain mechanism, and therefore resolve it because they've both agreed to that kind of dispute resolution mechanism, right? But what if that's completely missing, as it's missing from many of the smart contracts that are in existence today? Well, one of the things I think that the regulators miss, and a lot of lawyers and financial folks actually miss, is that the governance world that we live in today still is there, right? So if for some reason you execute through this smart contract and it works out, and then you find out later that someone was cheating on their adjusted rents, and you didn't have this on-chain mechanism to verify that, well, you go sue the person in the court of law. You're right. You would just go do that. It's just because the smart contract didn't cover that doesn't mean that you have no remedies. Now, so it depends on how you've drafted everything. History has shown us that companies don't necessarily care about that sometimes, and they'll still take liberties with the law. But you're right? Like theoretically, if you look at the options, you could have something that's on-chain governance. You could have something that's kind of not exactly on-chain, governance, but it could be kind of digital governance, where evidence is presented, et cetera. But if you think about what a court of law is, right? Like if you go in front of someone, it's effectively that, right? There's a trier of fact and some decision maker. Now, whether you've decided to do that through a court of law, Judge Judy, People's Court, or a kind of a crowdfunded arbitration mechanism that you've created that the two parties have agreed to abide by, that's up to the various parties, right? But the idea, I think, here is basically that if there is that gap, you can try to bridge it and understand that the real world does have solutions to a lot of these problems. Like, it's not it's not only in smart contracts that we have disputes, obviously. So there have been bodies of law, centuries of people, centuries of history behind this, where laws can be enforced, contracts and agreements can be enforced, right? So real estate is one of the more complicated examples. Even though it's so basic, you see that there's a lot of complicated thoughts that go into even a simple statement such as, I will give you 10% of the adjusted rents I collect. We had to think about all these things and where all these flaws were, where all the oracles needed to be, and where the inputs were, what the outputs were. That was pretty complicated, right? Let's look at another one that I'll do kind of as a instructor-led one, and we'll kind of come down in groups and just talk about this in smaller groups. Certain laws have a maximum number of allowable investors, sometimes depending on the type of investor, and there could be multiple types of investors, right? So this is something that would be reflective of maybe a corporate or a securities regulation as opposed to a contractual one. It could be contractual. I could go out to conduct a offering and say, look, I'm only limiting this to 50 investors or 50 token holders. That could be contractual, or it could be imposed on me by law, right? Like if I'm in Singapore or I'm in Japan and they say, well, in order for you to qualify under this exemption, you can have no more than 50 investors, and they have to be accredited, right? So the question again is, Can this be done exclusively by regular contract? In the interest of time, I would just go ahead and say, look, all these things and all these scenarios existed before blockchain and smart contracts. They can always be done by exclusively by regular contract. Sometimes perfectly, sometimes not perfectly. Even regular contracts have their gaps, and that's why we have litigation. So the question is, on this one, can this be done exclusively by a smart contract? Yes or no? This is kind of a complicated question because depending on which chain you're on and the capabilities of that chain, it could mean different things, right? But let's take Ethereum, for example, simply because I'm most familiar with it, but that's also what most people are using for these ICOs, STOs, et cetera, the types of offerings that would have these kind of investor limitations, right? And it turns out that you could code something, you could code a smart contract that says, I have 1 million tokens, but there can only ever be 50 unique addresses that hold it, right? So you could code that so that 51 comes and fails, right? The difficulty there, of course, is that what happens if the same investor goes and invests twice using 2 different addresses, right? Or you've got a pool of investors that combine and they decide to use 1 address, right? How do you deal with that? And how do you deal with the type of investor, right? Can you really code, if you're an accredited investor, then this? That requires some sort of input, right? Like the input is, this person is an accredited investor, but there is no known mechanism on a blockchain whereby you can do this. So theoretically, I suppose you could have someone on the blockchain conduct a verification and then other people confirm the verifications and things like that. And therefore you get a verified status, but that would require people coming onto the blockchain to provide that service. Currently, everyone that's providing that service, for example, like Verify Investor, my company, is offline doing that, right? Now we can report our results online, and then that smart contract can grab that data, but it's not an obvious thing, right? So cap on investors is a relatively simple thing. It could probably be done exclusively by smart contract, depending on chain that you were, with certain limitations. Understanding that identity is an issue that is a big issue that something like Ethereum or Bitcoin can never fully solve today. And different types of investors, that's doable, but it would require a third party reporting that into the chain and in some sort of reliable format. All right, so let's break into a group and just kind of talk about these other scenarios. And then I want to be more of a listener than a kind of a leader in these scenarios, and then we'll come back and do some takeaways, final takeaways. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, I'm similar. I've drank the Kool-Aid to some extent, but, I'm not a blockchain fanatic. I'm not a Bitcoin fanatic. To me, it's technology. I get about as excited about that as I get excited about Azure or PayPal or something. Like, it's cool, I'm gonna use PayPal, but like, honestly, it's got to serve a purpose for me to use it, right? So, as we all realize now, with hindsight, we saw that a lot of companies were forcing blockchain into it because either it helped them raise money, or they thought it was cool, or they were trying to build in some purpose into it, right? And this is not uncommon. We saw that with the green evolution. Every company was suddenly green, right? And they were trying to take advantage of those buzzwords. I think if you break it down and you look at the underlying technology and where it could be helpful, is certain things. Like, for example, like if I buy your house and then I sell my house to Pamela, and right now the existing world for title searches, et cetera, is we're paying some random third party a boatload of money to go verify that you've actually properly transferred me this house, and then I've properly transferred this house to her, because they've got to link the chain of title all the way through. And you don't trust one person to do it, so you're trusting this third party who is going to back it by insurance, effectively, right? So for something like that, blockchain is really interesting, because theoretically, they could build it such that you can't double spend, you can't transfer title to a house that you've already transferred, or if you don't have title to it, right? So it's very the technological innovations of blockchain technology and decentralized ledger technology, very useful, right? Another area where it's useful, which I tend to play a lot in, which is securities. And securities is, as a corporate securities attorney, even the clients that are getting great advice from like my law firm, if I go to them like 2 years after I've helped them and say, hey, let me see your cap table, who are your existing shareholders, it's almost always a scramble to figure out, okay, let me update it, let me make sure it's accurate. And that's not a problem limited just to private companies. If you look at a company like Dole Foods, big corporation, publicly traded, been around for a long time. Well, they had an embarrassing situation where they ended up having more shares outstanding than they actually were allowed to have, right? And that sort of thing wouldn't have happened if they had kind of utilized blockchain technology to track their shares. So if you think about it, and you think about DLT as this, ledger technology, the question is, for me in securities space, are digital securities better than paper securities? And to me, I think the answer is yes. And the second question is, would I rather have one person keep the books, or would I rather have multiple people keep the books? And the answer there for me, again, is, I'd rather have multiple people keep the books if I could. If you say yes to those two questions, now, I'm not on the cutting edge of technology, but I also am not aware of any other technology that's known to mankind, or at least not in mass. Maybe someone knows it and has kept it to themselves. But I don't know of any other technology where you can answer yes to those two questions and then solve it. Blockchain is the only technology at the moment, right? Or DLT, right? So securities, I think, is a good use case for it. The limitation there, of course, is that how limiting are the smart contracts? Can you do everything by a smart contract? And the real question is, can you do enough by a smart contract, right? And if you can do enough by a smart contract, and I think in securities you actually can, then you will get better tracking, better for the companies, better for the investors. You'll get better audit, better for the public, the community, better for the government, better for enforcers. And possibly you can eliminate some of the middlemen that exist in order to make sure that these mistakes don't happen, right? Some of the settlement people, some of the clearing houses and the transfer agents and things like that. Some of these people, a big portion of their function is to make sure that someone had something and had the right to give it to someone and someone properly received it, right? So this technology definitely could improve upon that. What of course some people don't like is that this technology has this idea that the trade could be the settlement, right? Like if I transfer you this share, theoretically, blockchain can make this settle instantaneously. We know for a fact it's mine. We know for a fact now it's yours. Not everyone wants that. Some people like the spread that they make during the 2-day period when it's technically not anyone's and it's theirs because they're custodying it, right? So, the question is whether the technology can do enough of the functions, and I think it can be. It's not proven out that that's true, but I do believe that it can be. And then also whether the existing world will accept it. And in financial markets, everyone's thinking that the future of securities is tokenized, but it's starting off today with a lot of people saying like, I'm going to do this to raise money. And having a better ledger system doesn't help you raise money, right? Maybe you use the buzzwords and you get some money and you get lucky that way. But in general, you have to have a quality project to attract quality lenders and investors. And if that doesn't happen, then you can tokenize anything and it's still going to fail. So I think it's a two-part kind of analysis there. That's an interesting thing because, there's technology and then there's regulations, right? So the technology, for example, could theoretically do away with certain types of custodians, right? But if the SEC says, well, you must put your money with a qualified custodian, well, it doesn't matter what technology you use, that's the rule. So until the regulations catch up with the technology, you have some of these issues. The other thing also is to not confuse what the technology does versus the behavior that it affects, right? So a lot of people think, you know, kind of like your statement, they said, okay, well, now startups can direct list and things like that. Well, yes, it's easier for them to do it because now there's this idea of a token, et cetera. But there was nothing stopping them before from, you know, doing a crowdfunded offering and then trying to trade it through some digital mechanism through an ATS. They could have done that earlier if they wanted to, right? It happens that DLT is probably superior technology to do it with because the audit and tracking is a little bit better because you could decentralize it. And it may be more efficient, but also because of the evolution of blockchain and how you had this craze of ICOs, et cetera, you had this kind of change in mentality where people were willing, enough people, commoners, were willing to buy these things and trade them. And that's a new behavior we haven't seen emerge for startups or private companies, you know, effectively for, as far as I know, forever, but my forever is really just the last few decades. So that's not really a function of blockchain. That's really more a behavioral change that it implicated. So that's very interesting. And this idea that everything has to be trustless, I also don't necessarily agree with that, especially not in a regulated space. In a regulated space, until the technology is more proven, the governments are probably going to feel more comfortable with regulated intermediaries, and therefore you've got this artificial kind of obstruction created by law and regulation and enforcement that holds back the promise of the technology. And it's probably okay, you know. I mean, if you look at a market, strong market like the U.S., people are very critical about our government and the SEC. But the reality is that they can adopt this new fledgling industry that is like a little bit, you know, to us it's a huge industry. To the real world, it's a blip, right? And risk the extremely established capital markets in financial infrastructure that they already have, or they can take their time, learn, and pass good laws, right? So they're doing the latter. I think it's actually smart. I don't agree with how long it's taking sometimes. I don't agree with the direction it's taking sometimes, but in general, I think they've done a more or less good job. Let's break into groups and work through a couple of more of these things, and then we'll come back for some like takeaways. And then just for the folks online or a video, you could download these, but here's the whole sheet, which I will leave up on here. All right. Okay, so we had a productive group discussion, I think, where we talked about dividends and confidentiality and NDAs. You know, if you want some additional resources, start with these things, perhaps. That CoinDesk article, I think, talked about some misconceptions of smart contracts that made sense. You know, for those of you that are in securities, definitely look at the ERC 1400. I gave a link to a reference implementation of ERC 1400 that's done by Polymath, but Consensus also has one. And if you just go to 1400 GitHub, it's quite helpful as well. Columbia Law Review article talked about kind of they studied a lot of these smart contracts to see if they covered what they said they were going to cover, and it was kind of abysmal failure in most cases. And actually, Chamber of Digital Commerce had a great paper written about smart contracts. Is the law ready? So these are all some sort of some resources that might be able to help you. If you need to contact me, here's some contact information. If you're interested in tokenization of securities as a topic, which we've covered a lot of those concepts, there's a LinkedIn group that's kind of dedicated to this thought process. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming and joining this session. It was late in the day and it was kind of a obscure and tough topic, so I'm glad you stuck through it. Thank you.